Robert Adamson, who was one of Australia's greatest poets, with a career spanning 5 decades and countless literary awards. He was a key player in the growth of the new Australian poetry and an editor of New Poetry from 1968 to 1982.
To me, this is a great poem by Australia's late great modernist, who, I think it's Creeley's phrase, says, dancing with words in particular, which seems to be the matter of the poem.
Thank you very much. He was always working on something.
I think people were stunned when they got their heads around Bob Adamson.
Always questioning.
I mean, I think everyone should read Bob, and I think he's probably the most accessible of a very impressive generation of poets.
With his wife, the photographer Juno, he published Paperbark Press, one of Australia's most important publishers of poetry, from 1986 to 2003. Over his lifetime, Adamson published 21 volumes of his poetry in Australia, the United States, and Great Britain, and his poems have been translated into several languages. He also published a celebrated autobiography, Inside Out, in 2004. In the last year of his life, Adamson assembled Birds and Fish, Life on the Hawkesbury River, Upswell 2024, a collection of his nature writings. After his death, I approached his wife, Juno, to float the idea of doing a tribute podcast in Robert's honour. She was enthusiastic.
This is really what he was made to do.
Then he kind of moved on to almost mystical sort of poems where he's writing about birds and the Hawkesbury that he's most famous for. But there's always this strange kind of interaction, as if he becomes the river, he becomes the bird. I find it really fascinating, actually. That
I'd had no training, been expelled from high school at year 11, so, my university was definitely what life had taught me. And here was this beautiful, gentle man who was in love with a river. Got to trust people that love rivers. Who was willing to share hours and hours in his home, pulling books off his bookshelves, opening pages and introducing me to poetry that otherwise I would still be a stranger to.
So, I look back and think, the generosity of him to make time for all of this, his genuine curiosity about our ideas about art and writing and music, the whole process of sharing. So that was pretty remarkable, because not all artists that are of his stature, even back then, are so kind of open to people.
We just shared many, many hours, sometimes staying up all night, reading each other poetry and playing music.
His poetry has always sustained me. I think the way that he evokes the Hawkesbury River, its ecology, its birds, its fish, and the presence of the Hawkesbury as a kind of, poetic muse, and just the resource that he's able to use it as this wonderful resource to draw on from his work, I think really makes Roberts one of the best and most rewarding of nature poets in Australia.
I always enjoyed Bob's company. He was attentive, enthusiastic, supportive. Undoubtedly there was an element of guile in that, but it was combined with a quality, a childlike quality of innocence, which I found very attractive, and there was no doubt about his commitment to poetry and to other poets.
You can see, look at this how these lines kind of move across the page in tercets almost, back and forth. It's really an exquisite poem.
It's interesting even now, fully a year over after he left us, I can still hear his voice, speaking over lunch when he was discussing poetry, the excitement that we get into his voice when you sort of start talking about a particular poem. We carry those memories with us, and once somebody like Robert's gone, we've got his work, we've got his poems to recall, and those of us who've met him and knew him, we have the the added pleasure of remembering the tone of his voice as he read them himself.
But I think, one thing that Bob really did well was belief. He believed in people, he believed in hope, he believed in his cats and in birds and in miracles. And it's so easy to write poetry that suffers, but it's so hard to write poetry that praises. And that's what I really loved about Bob. I used to see him as a kind of a broken and rebuilt mystic in a sense, someone who understood the miraculous because he had suffered enough to have something to compare it to.